Hi, my name's Liz Stauffer. I'm here at Brandt's Farm Supply to read the book that my grandmother wrote, Helen Rank. She wrote this years ago. We had it published after she had passed away. It's called In Search of the Bluebirds, and it's illustrated by Jen Dixon. In Search of the Bluebirds. Bruce and Ricky lived in a little white house at the edge of a woods. It was a delightful place, and the boys spent many hours exploring its trails and visiting their animal friends who made their homes there. A small stream wound and gurgled its way through the forest, widening at one spot into a deep pool. By the pool was a large flat rock, and they enjoyed lying on it and watching the tiny creatures in the water below. Very often they brought a lunch with them and shared it with the small swimmers. There was one sunfish, at least 6 inches long, who sometimes leapt out of the water as if to say, "Thank you for the treat." One evening, Daddy read them a bedtime story about a bluebird. When the story was finished, Ricky asked, "Daddy, have you ever seen a bluebird?" "Oh, yes," said Daddy. "They are small and have bright blue feathers and a beautiful song, and they are very useful to have around as they catch insects that would otherwise destroy the farmer's crops." "I have never seen one," said Ricky. "Neither have I," said Bruce. Daddy thought for a moment and said, I haven't seen any for a long time. They seem to have disappeared. It's very strange." After their mommy had tucked them into bed, the boys talked quietly for a while and agreed they would go into the woods the next day and ask their animal friends if they knew what happened to the bluebirds. In the morning, after breakfast, their mommy packed them a lunch, tucking in a few extra slices of bread for feeding the fish. The pool was always the first place they went after entering the woods. They knew they couldn't ask Mrs. Sunfish about the bluebirds, as she couldn't stay out of the water long enough to hold a conversation. However, she seemed very interested as they excitedly planned where they would go first. Suddenly, they spied Mr. Snapping Turtle sunning himself on a rock on the opposite bank. Usually, they let Mr. Snapping Turtle strictly alone, as he could be very grumpy at times and not at all friendly. Bruce said, "Turtles do live to be quite old. Maybe he knows something about the bluebirds. Let's be very polite and ask him." So Ricky said softly, "Mr. Snapping Turtle." But the turtle didn't move a muscle. He said again more loudly, "Mr. Snapping Turtle." Mr. Snapping Turtle opened one eye and said, "Humph! It's a pity one can't take a nap without being disturbed by rude boys." Bruce said, "We're sorry, but we wanted to ask you if you had ever seen a bluebird and why they seem to have gone away." "What do you want with a bluebird?" asked Mr. Snapping Turtle gruffly. "Daddy says they are pretty," said Ricky. "Pretty? Humph!" said Mr. Snapping Turtle. "I have more important things to do than to look for bluebirds," and he slid off the rock into the water. "Well, he wasn't much help," said Bruce. "Let's go find some of our animal friends and see if they know." Bruce and Ricky walked on until they came to the home of the rabbit family. Mrs. Rabbit was busy sweeping the doorway to the burrow. Her babies were tumbling about and having a fine time. "Hello, Mrs. Rabbit," said Bruce. "Where is Mr. Rabbit?" "Where he is always in the daytime, sleeping. At night he hops all over the place, lively as you please." "Oh my, these children do wear me out," she sighed as she picked up the smallest bunny out of a bramble bush. "They are always getting into trouble." However, the boys knew Mrs. Rabbit loved her babies and was proud that they were so healthy and lively. After visiting a while, Ricky asked, "Mrs. Rabbit, have you ever seen a bluebird?" "Oh, yes," she said. "You mean that jay who is always quarreling with the other birds?" "No, not him," said Bruce. "Blue jays are pretty too, but this is a smaller bluebird, and Daddy said they are useful to There used to be many of them around, but they seem to have disappeared." "I'm sorry," said Mrs. Rabbit. "I've never seen one. But I'm always so busy. I don't have much time to do anything but take care of my family." "Thank you," said Ricky. "We'll see you again soon." The boys went a short distance when they heard rustling and chattering in a tree above them. They looked up and saw Mr. Squirrel trying to get their attention. "Hi, Mr. Squirrel. How are you today?" asked Bruce. "Oh, I'm fine," said Mr. Squirrel, frisky as ever, and the boys knew it was true, as he never seemed to be still for a moment. After talking a while, Ricky asked Mr. Squirrel, "Have you ever seen a bluebird?" Mr. Squirrel said, "Let me see. I've seen red birds, yellow birds, black birds, brown birds, and speckled birds, but I can't remember ever seeing a bluebird. Come to think of it, though, I do remember my grandfather telling me of a family of bluebirds he once knew." "We would like to find out what happened to them," said Bruce. "There are none around anymore." Well, now that you mention it, said Mr. Squirrel, it's a puzzle to me. Thank you, Mr. Squirrel, said Ricky. We'll see you again soon. Oh, don't rush off, said Mr. Squirrel. Stay and visit a while. Some other time, said Ricky. We want to ask more of our woodland friends about the bluebirds. They walked a short distance when Ricky suddenly said, Stop! And they both stood very still, for there was Mrs. Skunk and her skunk kittens. The boys knew better than to walk up to a skunk and take her by surprise, as she could be very unpleasant at times. So Bruce called out, Hello, Mrs. Skunk. Mrs. Skunk turned and when she saw the boys, said, Hello, I'm glad to see you. Just look how much my babies have grown since you last saw them. Bruce and Ricky went closer and admired her young children, who were very cute with their little white stripes up their backs. Mrs. Skunk was pleased, and she enjoyed the boys' visits. Not many of the other forest creatures associated with her, so she was quite lonely at times. Finally, Ricky said, Mrs. Skunk, we are trying to find out where all the bluebirds have gone. Do you know why they have disappeared? No, I don't, said Mrs. Skunk. Perhaps Mr. Owl can help you. He's supposed to be very wise, but I have my doubts about that. Thank you, Mrs. Skunk, said Ricky. Goodbye for now. Come again, said Mrs. Skunk. You're always welcome. Bruce and Ricky hurried to the tree where Mr. Owl lived. They knew Mr. Owl hunted at night and slept in the daytime, but they hoped he wouldn't be too disturbed if they stopped by. Hello, Mr. Owl, said Ricky. We're sorry to wake you, but we have something important to ask you. Although Mr. Owl's eyesight was very poor in the daylight, he recognized the boys' voices and said, I'm glad you did. I was having a bad dream. What can I do for you? We would like to know if you've ever seen a bluebird, said Bruce. It's a small bird with a beautiful song, and there aren't any around anymore. Do you know why? Now the boys knew that owls sometimes ate little birds, and they thought maybe Mr. Owl had eaten all of them, and that's why they disappeared. But Mr. Owl said, I think I know the kind of bird you're looking for. I've seen plenty of them in my younger days. Bluebirds usually don't make their homes in the woods. They like open spaces. But as for the reason they've gone, I'm sorry, I really don't know. Thank you, Mr. Owl, said Ricky. Now we'll let you get back to sleep. Come by any time, invited Mr. Owl. We will, said Bruce. Pleasant dreams. The boys walked on until they came to a bush under which Mr. Fox was stretched out taking a nap. But foxes are very light sleepers, and as Bruce and Ricky came near, he opened his eyes and said, Hello, boys. What brings you to the woods so early? We've come to visit our friends and ask them why there aren't any more bluebirds around, said Ricky. What do you want with the bluebirds? Asked Mr. Fox. Daddy said they are pretty and useful, and we would like to have a family of them in our yard. We have all kinds of birds, but no bluebirds. I'm sorry, said Mr. Fox. I don't remember ever seeing one. But then birds don't come near me. I suppose they are afraid of me. Mr. Fox went on to tell the boys of an exciting experience he had the day before of how the farmer's dog had chased him, but he had outsmarted the dog and gotten away. Mr. Fox liked to brag about how clever he was, and the boys enjoyed listening to his stories, even though they knew he sometimes stretched the truth. We would like to stay longer, said Ricky, but it's getting late and we must be going. We'll see you again. Goodbye, said Mr. Fox. I hope you find your bluebirds. As they walked on, Bruce said, It seems we'll never learn what happened to the bluebirds. No one seems to know. Ricky said, Let's find Mr. Crow. He travels a lot, and he may have seen one. The boys were very fond of Mr. Crow, as he usually had an exciting story to tell them about his adventures. Mr. Crow saw them coming and flew to meet them. Hello there, he said. I'm glad to see you. Hello, Mr. Crow, said Ricky. What have you been up to lately? Mr. Crow said, The farmer put up a scarecrow, and I pretended to be very frightened. But when he went away, I flew into the field and helped myself to some corn. It was delicious. But you shouldn't do that, said Bruce. It's stealing, you know. Not really, Mr. Crow reasoned. The farmer always plants extra corn for the birds, and we do a lot of good for him in return. Ricky decided to change the subject and asked, Mr. Crow, have you ever seen a bluebird? A bluebird, said Mr. Crow. Why do you want to know that? Because Daddy said they are very pretty and have a lovely song and are very useful to have around. Mr. Crow's feelings were hurt because he always wished he could sing, but when he opened his beak, all that came out was a squawking sound. Also, he knew that some people considered him a pest and not at all attractive. So he said in a hurt tone, Well, black feathers may not be as pretty as blue, but I can't help the color I am. Oh, Mr. Crow, said Bruce, we think you are very handsome. We like all birds, and since you have been to so many places and know so much about so many things, we hoped you could help us find out why they have disappeared. Mr. Crow was pleased and said, It just so happens I visited with my cousins in another country last week, and he told me a family of bluebirds are looking for a new home. The place where they live is being paved over to make room for a shopping center, so when they come back next spring, they will have to find another home. I'll tell my cousin to invite them to your yard when I see him. Thank you, Mr. Crow, said Ricky. Then he asked, Mr. Crow, do you know the reason for the disappearance? No, I don't, said Mr. Crow. Perhaps the food became scarce and they couldn't find enough to eat. There could have been an epidemic of some kind. Bluebirds are not as strong as crows, he said a little boastfully. Tell your cousin there is plenty of space in our yard and food, said Bruce. We'll be happy to have them. The boys started for home. They chattered happily as they hurried along. On the way, they met Mr. Ground Mole, who, because he was blind, could not see them, but he, like the owl, recognized their voices. He asked why they sounded so excited. The boys told Mr. Ground Mole about their search for a bluebird, and now they might have a family come live in their yard. Colors are all the same to me, said Mr. Ground Mole, but I'll come one day and listen to them sing. We'll be glad to have you, said both the boys. They passed Mrs. Gartersnake, but she never seemed to have time to talk. She simply said, Hi, boys, and hurried on. They stopped by the pond to tell Mrs. Sunfish the good news, and she leapt almost 2 feet out of the water. She was so happy for them. When they reached home, they told Mommy and Daddy of their successful adventure. Mommy and Daddy hugged them, but reminded them that it would be a long time until bluebirds came, if they ever did. At the end of 2 weeks, Bruce and Ricky went back to see Mr. Crow, and he told them it was all arranged. The bluebirds were delighted to accept the invitation and would come to their yard when they flew back from the south next spring. So the summer passed, and it was time for the boys to go back to school. It was also time for the birds to fly south for the winter. The family put up feeders for the birds who remained. Their woodland friends were cozy in their burrows for the winter. Finally, spring came, and every day when the boys came home from school, they looked for the bluebirds. Daddy had helped them build a bluebird house, and everything was ready for them. Mr. Crow had said bluebirds were one of the first birds to arrive in the spring. The robins and the wrens, the orioles, the scarlet tangers, and all the others, but no bluebirds. The boys welcomed them all back, but they began to be a little worried about the bluebirds. Perhaps something happened to them, said Ricky. It's a long and dangerous journey from the south, and they may have gotten lost. I'm sure they'll come, said Bruce. Finally, when they had almost given up hope, they came home from school, and there they were, 2 bluebirds busily carrying twigs and grass into the house to build a nest. As the boys quietly watched them, Mr. Bluebird stopped working long enough to sing them a thank you tune. It was so beautiful. When school ended, the boys spent the happiest summer of their lives visiting with their animal friends in the forest and their bird friends in their yard. They did not forget to thank Mr. Crow for his help. They even became pretty good friends with Mr. Snapping Turtle. They discovered he had a lot of aches and pains, and that was why he was sometimes grumpy. When it was time for the boys to go back to school and the birds to fly south for the summer, Bruce and Ricky waved as each family of birds flew away. Last of all, they said goodbye to the bluebirds and all the little bluebirds. Don't forget to come back next spring, they called, and the boys knew in their hearts they would return. The end. Definitely messed up some. I tried to cover for it and keep going.